This is the Visions and Tones podcast with Dr. T.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Visions and Tones podcast. Today I'm talking to another young, great powerhouse who's in South Africa, and his name is Dr. Qinisani Qwabe, which we'll refer to him quite a lot as Dr. Q for today. Dr. Q is a lecturer at the Nelson Mandela University in the Department of Agricultural Sciences, and he is the recipient of the Mail and Guardian Top 200 Young South Africans. During his PhD, Dr. Q studied the relationship between indigenous vegetables, agro-biodiversity, and food security, drawing from the experiences of small-scale farmers from Ilembe, Kinkatshwayo, and Umkhanyakude district municipalities. Dr. Q's research, which centers on sustainable livelihoods, explicitly focuses on food security, agroecology, and rural development, and has earned his leadership role in the academic community. He has supervised 13 projects at the master's level and one PhD, basically demonstrating his leadership in guiding research. He is also the newly elected chairperson of the Australia-Africa University's Early Career Researchers Network. In addition to this, he is a member of the Student Hunger Steering Committee at the Nelson Mandela University, showing his commitment to addressing social issues. Dr. Q, I'm pretty sure your bio is way too longer than this, but this is the closest of what I can get. I know that you're always working on things, busy in conferences, also planning an overseas trip. But welcome to the Visions and Tones. I really appreciate you affording us this opportunity to chat with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Doctor. I loved how you said King Ketwayo.
Please behave yourself.
Ketwayo, by the way, is one of the significant leaders of the Zulu nation. I'm not sure how much you know about him. He is, I think, one of our greatest ancestors that we celebrate as a Zulu nation. Shaka comes after Abo Ketwayo and Abo Dinizulu, even Dinizulu, who are our kings that we regard as prominent figures.
How is it that Shaka becomes more famous than Ketwayo?
Well, the reason is because of what happened during Shaka's era. I think there was a lot of ups and downs, not just as it relates to fighting white people, but also there were intra-regional wars between peoples of the different clans within the Zulu nation. I can refer you to Shaka Ilembe, the latest documentary that has been nicely put together, which is available on.
Yeah, I haven't got any access of those, because I heard it's a beautiful production. And I've listened to a number of docus where the producers and the writers sort of explain the extent to which they've gone to sort of research about Shaka. But there still seems to be a little bit of differences with some of the people in the Zulu nation, as always, where some people would feel like the youth researchers have not done great work. There's certain bits and pieces of, the history that is sort of not outspoken or whatever the case. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of questioning to what extent can also docus or any kind of production give us the exact, parts of stories, including an account where certain things and ideas are just known by the main character, and reasons behind their behavior is sort of not known by many other people. So there's sort of that kind of limitation at the same time that I'm very much aware of. How true is it that he actually was also complicit in, turning against the Black population and the driving out of some of the people who ended up going to settle in, the Great Zimbabwe? Because, we do have few people who broke from the Zulu tribe there, and some have sort of crossed over towards the Xhosa nations and so on. But if you speak to them, they make reference to that they were part of the Zulu nation, but during the wars of kings and whatever, which Ushaka has been brought into the context also, then they had to flee just for safety. So how truthful is it, Uguti? His popularity is also due to complicity with the colonizers?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's because he was rubbing shoulders with colonizers. In fact, I think it was the quite opposite. The reason why people left and had to cross rivers, pregnant rivers, was because those were people that were fighting him at the time. They didn't want to see him ruling the Zulu nation or the clan where he was supposed to lead, KwaZulu. And when he became more powerful, and when they see that they can't really defeat him and they had to face this vicious man, they saw it best that it might be worth it to just exit space. And they ended up in different parts of Africa. I think that is how we ended up having Zulus in Malawi and Bulawayo as well.
Mm.
I want to say, though, during Shaka Ilembe, there is a part that I wrote about on Facebook. There's a scene that I wrote about on Facebook, which I think was quite fascinating for me because I'm in the food system. And it's when, oh, sorry, you haven't seen it, but there was a scene when a Mozambican guy was traveling with white people. They wanted ivory tusks, and Zulu people had a lot of those. So they traded, they convinced the Zulu guys. I've forgotten which clan. There's many clans when you watch Shaka Ilembe. You'll see. When they came, they then said, give us the ivory tusks. We are going to give you millis. And they even showed them how to eat millis, And so it then became a thing that this is something that has to be eaten. This is something that will now form a part of our food system. That's what I got from that episode in particular. And it then begs a question for me. One, when I watched Shaka Ilembe, I didn't see anything on indigenous foods of the Zulu people. And that for me was problematic. They bring in maize, a crop that is very new to Africa, and that is not even indigenized because we've got indigenized crops like your taros, your madumbis, and others. And yeah, for me, it was a thing of, yes, they are doing this, but there's another element that is missing, which forms a great part of our culture and heritage as Zulu people. And that is our food, because you can't separate us from that. And that was a bit of a lack. And so, as somebody who advocates for inclusive and resilient food systems, I wish I would have seen that coming out of that beautiful piece of work that those guys produced.
Yeah. So I love the fact, you're actually taking us to more your expertise here on indigenous foods, and you're speaking about inclusivity of foods. Can you sort of paint a picture for us exactly, coming from your PhD and the whole idea of inclusivity of indigenous foods? What exactly do you mean by that?
If you look around, Tony, I'm not sure how well you know about indigenous foods, but I'm just going to talk about African foods generally.
You can speak to me as though I'm a fifth grader.
Think about your taros, which would be your madumbis. Sweet potatoes is not our African crop, but because it does well in our production systems, we regard it as an indigenous crop. Different African nations have stamped it as an indigenous crop. There's many of such crops. You think of your bambaras. I think in Nigeria they've got plantains as well. There's many others that I can think of. But if you look around, if you look at your table when you go to a restaurant, you don't see Nigerian foods. You don't see bambara groundnuts. In fact, when you start talking about these, even your listener listening right now will even ask, what is bambara? They're probably going to go on Google to look for bambara groundnut as they hear the term. So for me, when we talk about building inclusive food systems, it's basically about recognizing each and every food that exists out there, every food item that exists out there, and also putting it to the general public's eye. We have it on. You think about spinach, they advertise it on television. You never see that with our indigenous foods. So let's see it on TV as well. Let's hear about it on radio. Let's see government pushing for our African indigenous foods. When they show those beautiful frameworks on nutritious foods, and they are saying that if you want vitamin A or vitamin whatever, let's see our indigenous foods being included there. Give you an example. In Africa, in the world at large, in Africa, I think it's the world or Africa. UNICEF will have to forgive me on this one. Not quite sure, but I think it's Africa, almost certain it's Africa. About 9 million children die every single year because of malnutrition, because also they lack vitamin A. There's a great deficiency when it comes to vitamin A. But if you look at our indigenous foods, particularly your leafy crops, think of blackjack. Ukatolo is what we call it in isiZulu. It's very rich in vitamin A. There's no need for people to be suffering from that. There's no need for people to be experiencing that deficiency, I would argue. Because if you go outside, the first thing that you are likely to come across is blackjack. It's regarded as a weed because when a white man came to South Africa, they regarded our indigenous crops as weeds. This is back in the 1960s during the Green Revolution. And so there was a stigma attached to these foods. And we then started seeing an increase in terms of the genetically modified organisms that are produced, not just at a commercial scale, even though that is where it started, but we saw these making way in people's individual spaces, in their backyards or in their small scale farms. And now what we are observing, as it relates to South Africa in particular, is that people have seriously lost touch with their indigenous foods. And when you go to each and every household that produces something, rest assured, you'll find spinach, cabbage, you'll find onions, and. Very good crops. I might say they play a very significant role if you think about food security as a broader term. But also, there's a greater benefit that comes with cultivating our own indigenous foods. I can give you a number of examples there. You don't need water for irrigation. You don't need to use herbicides or pesticides during the production. They are easily accessible. You can literally plant a crop today and leave seed for next year or for the next growing season. You can't do that with these genetically modified organisms.
Yeah.
And that's a major concern. And when we speak about a concept of sustainability, how do we sustain ourselves if at all times we need to go to organization X and buy from them a seed, enriching them when we can actually keep our own seed? Our grandmothers and our forefathers used to do that. Our grandmothers and grandfathers in rural areas, those that are very old, they still do this. But the sad thing is that we are now seeing a decline in terms of these practices. And it's a major cause for concern, Tony, I must say, because we don't want to lose this knowledge. We don't want to lose these foods in particular. And I think that is why now the United Nations, fortunately, has saw a need to invest in these indigenous food crops of Africa. The Food and Agriculture Organization has published quite a number of reports, and I think they've done quite a number of activities relating to that, just investing on indigenous food crops. Sorry, I can go on and on.
No, I'm happy with that because it's much informative rather than me just stopping you and, disrupting the flow. As you're talking about the decline there, are you able to sort of paint a picture for us so that we understand exactly how much of a decline is it? And seeing young people like you coming into the field, and according to your bio, you've sort of supervised about 13 young researchers in the master's field and one PhD, probably many other young scholars like you, even senior scholars like you, are doing the same. Would you say we are far to sort of having a redress into the plummeting of the numbers?
In terms of indigenous foods, particularly?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's still a lot that needs to be done, Tony. And I think where we currently are, and as FAO is beautifully doing, is to raise awareness. And I do think that it's going to take a bit of time before we get to a point where we want to be. But I'm hoping that won't be the case. And I say this because, as you would know, the United Nations has been saying over and over again that we are experiencing exponential growth in terms of people's numbers. And parallel to that, people are suffering. People are lacking employment. And this is now with particular reference to Africa. Our African people don't have employment. In South Africa, there's something that we call a triple threat challenge of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. I think that cuts across Africa. It's not just a South African thing. We see it all over. But where other African countries, I think, have it right, I always look at the Kenyan system, so beautiful, is that they haven't lost touch with their indigenous foods. I look at the books published in Kenya. I have colleagues in Kenya, from Kenya. They are keeping the agricultural economy standing through their indigenous foods and through farming in general, something which is not happening in countries like South Africa. I think we see ourselves as slightly developed than the rest of Africa, but also at the same time, there's something that we don't speak about, the hunger crisis that the country is experiencing. You will be shocked to learn that over 20 million people, which is 1/3 of our population, goes to bed hungry in South Africa. And over 2 million people in extreme poverty, extreme hunger. That is, they don't have access to food at any time of the day.
Wow. Well, the picture is clear in the context of South Africa. And I like the fact that you bring in Kenya here in the conversation. And I would really, really attest to the fact that people from Kenya are very proud of their indigenous foods. And I've noticed also in the context of those from Uganda and Nigeria, they do sort of love much more of their food. And you're speaking also of South Africa being slightly developed compared to many other, countries. Would you say, therefore, we still do sort of experience the kind of, the works of colonization, in a sense that even the return into indigenous food might not necessarily be a particular lack of seed, but it's because perhaps the preparation of it and also ways to access it might be a little bit challenging for South Africans, or even maybe the taste in itself. How many people would want to sort of embrace, some of the old traditional tastes? I don't know if you know of some of the bitter kind of spinach that we have. I don't know what the names are. You probably are in the field, but there's
Momorica forita.
Yeah. So those being kind of foods which most of the Gen Zs would say, well, this is bitter. We cannot sort of we cannot eat this. So I guess the question is, would you say even now with our Black administration as government, but the remnants of colonization still continues in the sense that we still do not see much more importance in embracing our indigenous foods?
Do you know what problem is in South Africa, Tony? For me, it's not only within the food systems itself, it's just a general practice. I think we look up to the West so much. I can make reference to America. There's something that South Africans like saying, we are the America of Africa, And that, for me, always gives me a picture of where we are in terms of our thinking and how our thinking has shifted. We dress like the Americans. We speak like the Americans. We want foods that Americans eat. We want to produce music that would be palatable, for a lack of a better term, to Americans. We want to feed within the global context, and we are modeling America so much. All our systems are now replicating what
Americanized, yeah.
America is doing, you know? That's the first problem that we have. The second problem that we are having, as you asked, is that of which, still relating to the American response, our people have this perception that indigenous foods are actually poor people's food. You talk to young people, they're going to tell you that why must we even talk about producing these foods? Who's going to eat them? I'm a lecturer. I teach plant production. I teach agroecology. And students are going to tell you, who are going to eat these foods? We want to eat cabbage. We want to eat spinach. We want to eat meat. Why are you telling us about amadumbe? Those things are not tasty. They are dry. Who's going to, what is ukbindwa in English? You know, when you are eating something and then it stays here on your throat and it's not going down, that is ukbindwa. Who is going to stand ukubindwa?
That's almost
Either
like
by
choking.
amadumbe, sweet potatoes, or whatever else. Choking, that's the term. That's the English term I'm looking for. Thank you. We don't want to be choked. If you think about the heavier ones, and when you talk about your leafy ones, like your amaranthus, your leafy greens generally, they will tell you that why would you go to the wild and pick up weeds? Like, those are the responses that I get. And then I bring these to the classroom for them to taste, and you'd see them frowning. They are not taking kindly to the foods. Not because they taste bad, because they would say, it tastes nice, but I just don't feel comfortable eating something that I know is weed. So we've got a perception problem. We still need to raise awareness in that area. That's for starters. So there's still a lot of stigma. There's still a lot of stigma attached to our indigenous foods. Our government isn't making as much effort as I think they should. I don't know why we're not looking up to African governments. They promote their indigenous foods so much. There aren't very much investments that we're making to promote or to try and commercialize indigenous foods, because I think that is where it starts. You can't go to people and say, grow these foods, they're going to sustain you, and if that's even an approach they are taking. If you want it to be adopted and to be taken seriously, let's see it being practiced at a commercial level. Why not just... Our government always has these initiatives in the agriculture ministry where they say, we're going to be giving you land, run this kind of a project, and they have their goals, they have their whatever. Why not give out land and say, we want you to produce indigenous crops? They can even list them if they want. Give us Bambara that is going to be about 20 tons or whatever tons that they want as a means of promoting these. And then they sell it to the people. They sell the concept to the people so that people see that this is something that you can survive with. This is something that shouldn't be seen as, it shouldn't be stigmatized, so to say. But we don't see those kinds of investments. We don't see those kinds of initiatives. So our government is largely to blame as well. We've got people who also, when I speak about government, I always think of them as well. Our extension officers, these are people that give that provide advisory services to farmers, particularly small farmers when they work in the agriculture ministry. And many of them are from the ministry. There's a few private ones. They don't talk about indigenous foods. They don't talk about how these can help form part of the broader inclusive food system. It's always about, when you're growing spinach, you need to use this at the planting stage. You need to use this as top dressing. And when you harvest in a particular manner. But hold on a bit. I'm in KZN, KwaZulu-Natal. Why don't you tell me about amadumbe? Why don't you tell me about izindlubu? Or at least ukatolo? Something that still needs to be cultivated, you know? Right now it grows in the wild, but then we might be seeing a decline just like we are seeing with your Momoreka forita in Chungu. I think that's the bitter spinach you're referring to earlier. So we still have a problem in that sense, Tony.
I mean, obviously, one would say probably the move from, promoting indigenous systems is also thinking in terms of economy. How well are we sort of going to thrive in terms of, the economy? Because South Africa's close ties with the global north. What kinds of foods has been eaten in the global north? It's completely different to the kind of foods that you're sort of referring to, the indigenous foods you're referring to. I remember was it sometime around 2008 or somewhere there, in the era of President Mbeki, if you remember, when he made statements about eating indigenous foods to sort of as a way to sort of gain nutrition prior to taking ARVs within the context of the HIV conversation. And the then Minister of Health, I think it was Mem Manto Shabalala-Msimang, they actually spoke about African potatoes and they spoke about your garlic and many other things. I'm not sure whether your things like garlic would be considered as indigenous foods, considering how there's too many debates about it, even how poisonous it is, but at the same time, medicinal it is, as opposed to it being included into foods like that we use in the kitchen. So the West sort of kind of laughs about, the use of those indigenous things, but at the same time, I think they had a point, and it was still around those times, maybe a little earlier than 2008 when I was still in
2006.
Primary. It was in 2006, yeah. But earlier than 2006, I remember when I was still in primary doing Standard 3, our education system, I was in sort of semi-rural area. I remember there used to be a group of teachers who sort of had gone through the formal training, and now they sort of have to come and do placement. I think in South Africa would call it internship, training to see, and then there'll be supervisors who will come and check whether these people are, good in teaching and whatsoever. Our curriculum then, we used to sort of do a whole lot of indigenous foods, and we're sort of asked to bring in fruits which we could share in class, and then the teachers would sort of give a whole teaching about them, what this is, and the genealogy, and so on and so forth. But again, some of the stuff really, there might not necessarily be our indigenous foods, but it's what we consider today as indigenous foods, as you said, because I think with your expertise, you'll be able to tell us exactly. For instance, sweet potato is some of the things in the context of vegetables that people brought, but you just sort of told us right now that, sweet potato is not necessarily our food, but we sort of adopted it to be parts of our food. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is to say the moving away from indigenous foods, I think it's partly because we thought of also our investors, where else actually had we embraced our indigenous foods, we could be doing far great as a society. Perhaps my next question to you would be, in order for us to get back again into the embracement, apart from just giving a budget and, funding PhD students to sort of promote indigenous knowledges, would you say the aspect of even using celebrities to sort of advertise, for instance, indigenous foods and promote health and whatsoever, would you say that can be another way which we can sort of revive our indigenous knowledges? Because I'm thinking, look at the way in which our celebrities are behaving today and how mass media is using them. It's because we're mimicking things from America through mass media, right? And movie productions and so on and so forth. Therefore, looking up to the very same high icons, TV personalities, I'm thinking, would you say that can also be a better way to sort of get back to our indigenization than as an addition to what is already happening, funding PhD programs and master's programs and so on and so forth?
I mean, celebrities are highly influential figures. I'm just thinking of a very, very extreme example here. I mean, as you were saying, as you were asking that question, at the back of my mind, I was like, I'm just thinking of Beyonce eating a madumbe.
I mean, it wouldn't be bad. She's able to come and make all music videos and productions and whatsoever and talk about streets of gold and whatnot. And people buy into that, right? We see different movies of Wakanda and people buy into that, but it's a complete different thing.
Exactly. And to bring it home, I'm not sure if you know of a musician called Big Zulu. He's made it
yeah.
big, I would say, in the African continent, but more in Africa, in the sub-Sahara. There's a song of his where he says, "Ngifuna ukuba nemali." He paints them bad. He paints these foods bad, this particular crop bad. But then in him doing that, he gets a different kind of response from the general public. For instance, the song says, "Ngifuna ukuba nemali, ngikhathela amadumbe, and." He's
Translation.
tired of. So it basically means that he wants to have more money. He's tired of eating matumbes, which is an indigenous crop. And when I first heard that, I laughed. I literally laughed. And then when I started thinking about it at a deeper level, I was like, actually, this guy is sending a message. He's tired of eating amadumbe because amadumbe is that food item that is eaten by people that don't have money. And that's not how it's supposed to be. And when I then kept reading comments on YouTube, people were talking about Amadumbe, and it seems to be the most common line from that song. They're talking about Amadumbe, saying that many were asking, what are Amadumbe? Where can we get Amadumbe? So there was some sort of awareness raised there, even though the message was towards the opposite direction. Now, you can imagine if the musician intentionally was promoting Amadumbe and dwelt much and tried promoting them, I think the entire nation would be eating Amadumbe right now. Media has a very important role to play in raising this awareness, Tony, not just with celebrities, as we are saying. There's a number of ways in which we can do this. We are not doing it. In KZN, Ukhozi FM, one of the biggest radio stations in Africa, tries to promote indigenous foods. I think everything of theirs is somewhat linked to the Zulu culture and traditions. And I think that's a beautiful thing. If it was up to me, all regions in Africa would have such initiatives where they've got a project like the TV or radio project that seriously covers regional. What do I refer to them? I don't want to put it in the context of food alone, but regional
Heritage
practices.
and yeah.
Okay, we can go for the term heritage. Heritage practices or whatever is practiced in the region. It's a way of preserving our knowledge, but also it's a way of commercializing that which we believe in. There was a point where I wanted to make a comment on what happens in the Zulu nation as well. I think it was during the time when we were talking about Ushaga and indigenous foods. During Heritage Day, I think on the 24th of September in South Africa, we celebrate our culture and tradition. And in KZN, you see people carrying different types of indigenous foods. No one is carrying spinach, no one is carrying cabbage. We are trading, sort of like bartering amongst ourselves. And we have these ceremonial activities that take place, just appreciating our culture and our food. Food is a very important part of that, of these ceremonies that you would see during that day and that week as well. And for me, if we made this an everyday thing, we wouldn't be having the conversation that we are having right now, because it signals something that there really is a role that is played by this. We call them actually underutilized indigenous and traditional food crops because some of them are not indigenous, some of them are just traditional crops. There's a role that they play in our food systems, but not much is said about them. They are just abandoned. They are just the lost crops of Africa. And I would think that many people refer to them as that at the back of their minds, especially in the developed world.
Wow. So if we are ever to do a serious revolutionary change, you are now being employed as a young person, meaning think age differences, male think gender differences. You are now employed as the minister. What kind of serious changes would you sort of bring in South Africa?
That's a very interesting question. I've never thought about that. Oh God, Tony, that's a very broad question. I think for me, it would be, God, you know, in the context of food systems, building inclusive food systems, it's not only about you producing as a commercial farmer, you producing your spinach and integrating that with your madumbes, which is very important. I think that is what should actually be happening. But where it would start for me is within the classroom, at a primary level. You spoke about something that should be taken seriously. Introducing agriculture as an independent subject at a primary school level. I appreciate what the Department of Basic Education has done in South Africa. I looked at their grade, I think that was a grade 5 book, their grade 5 book. And, they teach about crop production, they teach about livestock production, and now they've got indigenous knowledge systems where they talk about our indigenous foods. And I thought that was such a beautiful thing. But it's not offered as an individual subject. It's just a section. I'm lying. Sorry. I'm so sorry. It's not basic it is basic education, but it's grade 10. It's not grade 5. So at the lower levels, grades 1 to 9, there's no agriculture that is offered as a subject. And that's a major that's something that seriously needs to be addressed. Natural sciences should cover components of agriculture, but we don't see that. I look at their curriculum and it's the most sad thing ever. So if we had it as an independent subject, we would go far. We raise awareness from the very early stages. We tell our learners that we need to appreciate our foods, our local foods. You see that umfino that ukoko is always cooking at home, that she harvests in the wild, in the forest. That is actually a very good source of protein. It's a very good source of vitamin A. Such things need to be articulated. We need to plant those things in our from a very early development stage of learners. And I think I was lucky because I was taught by teachers who did that. I don't know why, but they would always, probably because they were also citizens from the area as well. And they ate the very same foods that everybody else was eating. And so they didn't attach any stigma to them. So that was a beautiful thing. And I think that is partly how my love for these indigenous foods came about. It's actually a number of things that inspired that. The second one, still on the curriculum, I question to this day, when you go to a university level, I teach plant production now. The first thing that I did when I got to higher education was to look at the curriculum, the course outline. I looked at the curriculum, not even a single focus on indigenous knowledge. And you ask yourself why, when you are teaching the indigenous people, when you are trying to bring solutions to Africa, but we are only relying on things that were brought about by the Americans. I mean, you look at the history of how spinach was brought to Africa, or these conventional crops, how they were brought to Africa. It wasn't the best of methodologies, especially because it came with a touching stigma to what was already working for the African people. And now, I know I said I appreciate the work that is done by the UN, but now the conversation is, let's go back to indigenous ways of doing things. But I mean, hang on. These are the very same guys that actually caused the damage. They are the reason why we are where we are. And now, if you want to correct that, let's go back to the school curriculum from the lower grades. Let's go to higher education as well. What are we teaching in higher education? In my plant production, I'll tell you now, I teach. Okay, I think I'm a special case. This is not the South African case or the African case.
Okay.
I teach, or generally what is taught is on your conventional crops. Your industrial agriculture is the order of the day. Even when we teach about organic farming practices, we still talk about spinach, cabbage, and what. Nobody talks about Bambara groundnuts. Nobody is going to be talking about inchungo, imbilikitane, for instance, And again, that's still a problem. And there I am because somebody has realized that we need to bring balance. I now teach at an honors level agroecology, which is basically about farming with the environment in a way that doesn't harm the environment, but also bringing in the element of food sovereignty as a means of sustaining people's livelihoods. That's where we talk about indigenous practices mainly because our ways are associated with sustainability. African ways generally, in whatever context, they are associated with this concept that everybody else seems to like nowadays, which is sustainability. Somebody refers to it as a buzzword and it frustrates them. But yeah, it would be the curriculum for starters. Secondly, how we teach extension is very important. Those, as I mentioned earlier, would be your advisors. I'm a trained extensionist, by the way, from undergrad right through my PhD. How we train extensionists should be in a transformed manner. Let's not teach extension practitioners to teach the book. Let them understand the context of the I almost said the Aboriginal people. I've forgotten that's the term that you guys use in Australia. Let them understand the context of indigenous people and they work around that. Let them do research relevant to the context of the people, But also, there's a need for them to always improve their knowledge because the current challenge that we have in Africa generally is that your extension advisors would be the elderly, and it's mainly the elderly, who graduated 30 years ago. They still talk about things that were in the curriculum 30 years ago. And then it was even worse than now because the strong focus was on genetically modified organisms, your synthetic fertilizers, everything that Africa does not stand for. I don't think we stand for those things. It's things that were imposed on us, forced on us, if you like. So if we could change that, I think it would be a great start. But also, I would ensure that all ministries play a role in building sustainable food systems. It must not be a thing of the Department of Agriculture alone. In fact, I don't think that ministry should work as a single ministry. They should be working with everybody, social development, education, higher education, all ministries, just like we are seeing with Treasury. It should be like that if we really, because it's everybody's responsibility to ensure that we are a food secure nation, especially at an individual level. So if we were to do that, I think we'd get somewhere.
And as a minister, if someone was to put an argument about, particularly on the curriculum, teaching agriculture in either basic or secondary or even tertiary institution, that would sort of raise the land question for people who would say, I want to go and be, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, right? For one would say, I want to be an entrepreneur. So how would you sort of tackle that, considering that at this particular moment, the land question is a contentious question in South Africa? And also the fact that I'm not sure whether in terms of your curriculum, do you also touch on where exactly do we plant some of the indigenous foods, the debate between low ground versus the use of hydroponics and how all that also speaks about the livelihood of the soil, the ecosystem of the soil. The fact that soil low on ground can be more lively compared to soil on hydroponics. There's no life in hydroponics, so to say.
I'll start with the last part of your question, and I'm laughing because one of my students asked me about hydroponics. We're covering a section on hydroponics, and they're asking, what do you think about the concept of hydroponics? You seem to be very much of a person that believes in traditional ways of doing things. And that was a very good observation, because I prefer my food coming from the ground. Not that there's anything with hydroponically produced foods, but I just prefer my food grown from the ground. But it's interesting that you raised that question, because yesterday I was in this new network that the University of Cape Town just established, the Agroecology Knowledge Network. And I was chatting with a colleague from Stellenbosch University, Dr. Ethel Peary, who also specializes in indigenous food crops. And she was saying that when she did her experiments in Stellenbosch, in the early stages of her research, she was told that you can't actually do this here. You can't grow these foods here. The climate doesn't favor what you want to bring to the Western Cape. And so, knowing what she knows, like myself, I know very well that when you talk about indigenous foods, we are talking about crops that can literally grow anywhere, in any type of soil even. She brought this. She had 95 experimental sites, and in all of them, across all those 79 sites, she was able to produce without irrigating, without putting fertilizer, and she was able to run the tests there. So in terms of land for producing indigenous food crops, that should be the least of our concerns, I would say. You look back in history, our forefathers used to be nomads. They would survive here today, and tomorrow they're elsewhere, and they would stay about 6 months. And after the Paleolithic times, they saw a need to start growing foods, and this is what we now consider as indigenous foods. They would plant crop during that 6 month when they are there, and they didn't care what type of soil there was. They just cultivated, they tilled the soil, and they would put these seeds that they had. And so it's been like that for over centuries. I can literally take madumbis from the north of KZN and go to Northwest. I'm going to be able to produce madumbis. I can go to Kenya. I'll be able to produce madumbis. In fact, as we speak, we've got Kenyan crops being grown in South Africa at the University of Pretoria in Future Africa. You and I recently had a conversation, I think, around planted foods. Yeah. If you go to a section of Port Elizabeth, there's a small Zimbabwean community and a small Mozambican community. They have their indigenous foods grown there, you know? So I think that should be the list of our worries in terms of distributing land for indigenous food crops. I thought the question was going to be around the land question, where I stand on the land question, and I'm not probing you to ask me, please do not.
No. But you are right. It wasn't necessarily, you are right in terms of what you thought of, because I can hear your response, but I felt like you sort of curved that part. Because remember, the reason why I'm bringing the question about land is because earlier on also I touched about the point of economy. Who are we going to trade with? The issues of the market, the global South, South Africa kind of rubbing shoulders with some of the big giants in the global North. But again, looking at political landscape of South Africa in terms of, ownership of land and so on and so forth. So if you sort of give young people, and of which basically trying to bring in a different layer into the conversation, but I still feel like it's part of looking at conversations such as, decolonizing education, the whole conversation of, university students saying the current curriculum trains students to be perfect employees as opposed to be employers. Then if we are to sort of bring that kind of a decolonial turn into agriculture and the curriculum in the way that you've sort of paved for us in the context of basic and secondary and tertiary education, to sort of teach people agriculture might sort of give the impression, therefore, that, we're giving you the hope of you having to be in ownership of your own business. But having your own business in this particular case if we are to put away issues of hydroponics, which seems to try to address the issue of land ownership, then we remain with the fact that if we need ground, therefore, I need to sort of have a space for myself. But we're talking about a country with high poverty rate. Even today, you still find probably first, second generation university attendees being the young people, far to making even enough money that they can say in the near future, I'll buy my own land. You're talking about issues of red taping. If we look into the context of the banks, we're looking at Mbeki's failed policies of willing buyer, willing seller. So I think that question still, it's more on agriculture, but it also has to touch basically the politics of ownership in that sense. Because if you're going to teach young people agriculture, it's in relation to, okay, then how does my future look like? So if we are to address issues of indigenous foods, I don't think we just have to focus only on using education, celebrities, and so on and so forth, but it should also speak to the issues of access to the land. And I'm sorry for throwing all this.
No. I like the direction that you're taking, in fact. As it relates to land, yes, when we produce indigenous food crops, you need to have land, and we are talking about land. It's not like when you're growing in a 3 by 1.5 meter plot. When you're producing spinach, you do need a bit of space. And so it begs, what do you do then in instances where you don't have land? And I think that for me is a very important question, because people don't have access to land. Many of us don't have access to land. And if you recall, we've had this ongoing conversation around Black people not accessing land in South Africa. I've tried accessing land. I've failed. When you are speaking about young professionals that are highly educated, that feel that they can make a difference, but because of the red taping, they can't access land. I'm one of those people. You are talking about me. So my thing is, this is one of the things that the agriculture ministry needs to seriously sit and develop a clear strategy on. There needs to be an approach to distributing land in a manner that is going to benefit the people. One of the parties strongly pushed for Black people having access to land, but still under the state,
Custodianship of the state, yeah.
Yes, the ownership of the state, sorry. And I thought that was a beautiful way of thinking, because there's two things here. If we want people to work the land, if we want people to enrich themselves, I think it's been proven time and time again that land as a resource can actually help you to make your own riches in a way. It can also help you to sustain yourself if we are talking about this in the context of food, because you can produce enough to feed yourself and then you can sell, which is a surplus. We can also take a look at what is happening in our neighboring countries in SADC and the diaspora. Most African countries are using a similar system. They own the land. We can't, unfortunately. I don't think that is the position we should be taking, where people own the land. Let me give Tony land for X number of years, for 5 years. Let me see what he does with the land. And if he produces something, you're not building any permanent structures there. Maybe one or two if you are running a business. Let's see Tony producing either indigenous food crops. Now I'm taking this in the out of the context of indigenous food crops. Let's see Tony growing a crop in a 5-hectare plot. Let's see how that sustains him, but also let's see what role he is playing in growing the country's economy, because there has to be a benefit as well if you are using the state resources. Even if it's not the state resources, everyone must contribute to the country's GDP. And if Tony is doing a good job, then why take away land from him? Let's extend by 10 years. Let's see how he does it in the next 10 years. And if he still does well, let's give him for the next 20 years. It's still under state ownership, but let's keep extending. When Tony dies, because I know that's going to be your next question, When Tony dies and he has children, he's got a family and whatnot, we have that on our record. Tony surely would have mentored his relatives, his children, or whoever. Let them inherit that land for the duration of that period. Let's see what they do with the land, with a piece of land. And if they are still carrying Tony's legacy as he practiced, then let's continue the same process. Let's keep on extending and seeing how they work the soil and contributing to the GDP. That way you are empowering people. You are saying, we realize that you've got the means of making this sort of contribution. Then we are creating an enabling environment for you. Let's see that. Let's not see land lying around, not being in use, as we are currently seeing in South Africa. There's a lot of land that's just left unused. And yeah, I think if we could take that approach, we would eventually get somewhere.
Actually,
but also, sorry. There's a question I didn't answer. You said, if now we take away our introduced crops and we mainly focus on our indigenous crops, who's going to buy them? Because we exist in a global market. Our agriculture system is fortunately advanced in that manner. We play part in the import-export market. That's a challenging one, in a sense that our agriculture GDP in South Africa mainly comes because we are trading with other countries and they don't buy indigenous crops. They buy that which relates to them. The developed world don't really have interest in our indigenous foods, at least as yet. But then I guess this is when we can then say, hey, let's look at other African countries. I mean, we are producing for our people. We are not saying let's do away completely with introduced crops, but let's include these as part of inclusive food system. We are not saying, when we advocate for this, we are not saying that we must do away with the other and focus on one. No, let's integrate them. Let there be a blend. Let's produce for our people. Let's produce to sustain ourselves as well. You think about maize. When we produce maize, which we do quite a lot in Africa, in South Africa and Africa at large, who uses this maize? When we process it to mealie meal, who uses it? It's African people. We trade amongst ourselves. So what would stop us when we are producing maize from dumbis or cassava?
I mean, I don't want to give political parties any air on this show because, and we know in less than 3 weeks, there is also elections in South Africa. But what I wanted to sort of echo is that I thought you were actually problematizing the one party that is revolutionary on the conversation of land. But as I hear you actually explaining, lo and behold, you're actually explaining exactly as they're explaining it. I don't know whether you are aware of it, but I thought
I am. That's why I was quoting
you were. Yeah, I thought you were problematizing them, but exactly as you've put it out, even in terms of alternatives, in terms of the economy now trading with African countries, that's exactly the perspective that they would actually hold. And I like the fact that also you are making reference to using agriculture even in our homes. It's not just mainly about land and thinking about trading only with the West. We can trade also with, the African context, but at the same time, it could be for our own household consumption so that we also try to sort of balance the high standard of living. I was impressed on Sunday. I went to visit a friend of mine. She's American. She came onto the show and we had a great conversation about race and racism and diversity, inclusion, and so on and so forth. And as she was walking me out, she was ready to prepare dinner, and I just saw her plugging things from her garden, and I was like, but it was a nice garden in sort of, small pots, not like whole big open land. And I was wondering what she's plugging. When I went closer, she has like beautiful rosemary, she's got beautiful oregano, beautiful bay leaves, and she was getting everything from her. And I looked at it, I was like, actually, this is amazing. And I was like, I should actually try to think into that context too, because all those things that she was plugging, they're very expensive if you go into the supermarket to try to get those. And I was like, here's somebody who's actually saving extra money for herself. You know, she did the actual hard work of overspending just to get you a small household garden. But in the long run, she's actually not struggling in terms of purchasing all these things. I felt like that was a beautiful idea. So maybe, Doc, if you can sort of tie it up for us towards that angle, what can you say about that kind of an approach? And how should South Africans embrace that kind of an approach, including those who live in the suburbs, those who've got big balconies? They shouldn't think that the balconies is just for, but decoration plants, but they can also think about edibles to sort of try balance their economic standard of living.
It's interesting you're asking me that. On screen, I'm showing you a post that I made exactly a month ago on LinkedIn. And I'm going to read it verbatim. And it answers exactly what you're asking. So I was posting my vegetable garden there. It has a number of crops: pumpkin, celery, leeks, kale. There's others. I won't mention them one by one. So it reads, every little space counts. This is a common statement that's often proclaimed by people in the politics of food, myself included. Theoretically, it sounds good, but in reality, I don't think so, said one of the participants in a seminar where I was a speaker last year. So I then put this to a test and started growing vegetables in my 1.5 square meter patch in my backyard. And for the past 5 months, I haven't bought spinach, kale, chilies, celery, lettuce, and mint. It's definitely not a lot, but it sure saves me that 25 rands that I would spend for a bag of mint that would end up spoiling in a refrigerator. It saves me that 16 rands 99 that I would spend for spinach whenever I feel like having an all-green smoothie. As for the kale and lettuce that I love so much, I only need 2 or 3 leaves to get a filling salad. Another 60 rands saved. Same with celery and chilies. And the most fascinating thing is that one doesn't even need to use expensive inputs to enrich the dead soils of Gqeberha, which is where I'm currently based. Just 1 bag of compost to kickstart the project and throwing back earthly waste to the soil whenever possible. These crops also sustain themselves if one doesn't tamper with the root systems and are well irrigated.
Wow.
I don't
Very
know
profound.
what else
Wow.
you want me to say, but that is how I would like to wrap this up and in response to your question.
That's amazing. As you said, you want to create verbatim. It's actually just self-explanatory in that way. So much money to save. Yes, in the beginning, it might feel like it's a pain. If you're not a person who's used to sort of watering the garden, you might want to start getting into the attitude of doing that. It's part of an exercise at the same time. It's part of the therapeutic aspect of things, but definitely it's going to save you quite a lot in your pocket.
Yeah, it does. It does, Tony. I don't know how I can articulate this, but the joy of going to your garden and you're just picking spinach. I mean, you don't eat it every day. You harvest spinach, you keep on watering it. In the next 4 or 5 days, you'll be able to harvest again celery and whatever else as well. I don't know why we are not really taking this seriously. I was actually taken when you said you saw your friend picking something from the garden and you're like, wow. So it's good if you were wowed in that space. But in Africa, now that wow is frowned upon by the elderly because back in the day, people used to produce quite a lot. That's where we are now. It's a thing if somebody is producing, even in some rural spaces where agriculture is mainly practiced for subsistence purposes. But back in the day, if you didn't have anything, if you had to go and buy onions, people would just look at you in a funny way and be like, what's wrong with this woman? What's wrong with this guy? Why are they not producing their own items? Because these are very easy to grow. I mean, you don't need to waste money on things. My grandmother still tells you to this day, "Ngeke ungiboneke mina ngithenga u-anyanisi." You won't see me buying onions. She doesn't buy many vegetables because she grows them herself, you know.
Nice.
And if the elderly generation could do it, I keep asking myself, why can't we do it? And this is not within the context of indigenous foods now, just vegetables in general. Why can't we sustain ourselves when we know that we need to nourish ourselves on a daily basis? Why don't we produce to nourish ourselves?
That's beautiful. I really love that. I love your insight. I love the fact that you actually gave me your time, Doc. I know that it was a pressing scheduled appointment. Thank you so much. If you can share with us what's next. I know that you're a busy person. You've got a trip overseas. You're busy running conferences. You're busy running Harvest Chronicles podcast. What's next? What should we look out for in the pipeline in terms of your work?
I'm not sure if I should say this online, but the greater thing for me, surely you would have seen that I'm running sustainability projects on food, practically so, around campus where I'm currently based. The plan for me, medium-term plan, is to really start my own farm. I'm going to go back to farming. That's my plan. I don't want to do it where I'm just employed. I want to do it in communities, in a community from where I come. I'm going back. As you would know, I used to farm before. So I want to go back to that. But in doing so, I want to work closely to the elderly generation, learn as much as I can from them. I don't want to do it on my own. I want to seriously draw from the experiences of these gurus that have been practicing agriculture for the most part of their lives. But in so doing, I also want to work with young people, my peers. It's going to be an open setup where I allow young people to come if they want to chip in, lend a helping hand, they do it, and maybe go with a bunch of spinach at the end of the day. I really want to see this inclusive food systems thing be success, and the integration of introduced crops and our underutilized indigenous and traditional crops in a single system, because that is what inclusivity is about. I want to see that coming to fruition, but also attached to that, I want to see certain knowledges being passed down from the elderly to us, the younger generation, and also us just co-sharing that knowledge amongst ourselves, which is one of the core principles of agroecology, by the way. It's co-sharing of knowledge, which I think is very much important, because that is another way of driving sustainability through teachings and through practical applications of what we speak.
Amazing. That sounds really like a beautiful plan, Doc, and I wish you all the best. I say may the earth and the ancestors and God give you a green light, and may you succeed in all the plans. Really meaning it deeply
much.
from our heart. Yeah.
Thank you very
and
much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
coming.
for having me on your show. I truly appreciate it.
Thanks, Doc. Listeners of the Visions and Tones, that was Dr. Q. Dr. Q is an amazing young person. I will share more of his details. Just keep watching our social media spaces. Part of the other great work that he does that I forgot to mention at the beginning of this entry is that he's also a podcaster, running a podcast called Harvest Chronicles. There's beautiful harvests basically happening there, bring in beautiful guests from multidisciplinary spaces. So do save some time and go check out his work. Thank you so much for choosing us today, and go ye and be best human beings and best versions of yourselves. And we are out. Cheers.
This is the Visions and Tones podcast with Dr. T.